carry on. So thanks Rajarshi and thanks everyone for being here. So over
Thank
to
you
you.
for having me.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you, Rajarshi. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. So Rajarshi is a long-time friend and colleague now, of course, and as I know him, a man of many talents, a gourmet, avid horror film buff, blogger, photographer. So a lot, there's a lot to explore there. But let me nonetheless give you a very formal introduction that we have. So Dr. Rajarshi Mitra is assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Information Technology, Guwahati. Before joining IIT Guwahati, he was assistant professor in the Department of English at the Central University of Karnataka. He had an MPhil from the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad, and a PhD from the Department of English Literature at EFLU, or English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. For his PhD, he had worked on natural history narratives from India between 1857 and 1950, and his MPhil was on colonial tiger hunting narratives. His research interests include food and culture, horror films, romanticism and literature, and colonialism in general. In IIIT-G, he offers courses on science fiction, film studies, and indie writing in English. So over to you, Rajarshi. The stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, first of all. What I will do is I'll just try to present the window. I have just 3 slides, not more than that. And I have a formal talk prepared for you. I'll do that. I'll just present. Okay, so if you can see the presentation, this is how I have structured my talk. I have structured my talk by, okay, I'm going to begin by talking about how Shikar or hunting is talked about in the academic circles. I will talk briefly about why we are studying Shikar or hunting. I'll briefly talk about the title of my paper today or my talk today. And then we will look at the concept of Shikar in the early 19th century. And I will end this talk by looking at one of the first, or probably the first, Shikar narrative or hunting narrative from colonial India, Oriental Field Sports, 1808, written by Mr. Thomas Williamson. This became a very popular book, and it became so popular that even some of the romantic writers, Robert Southey and others, decided to reference it when they were writing about the Orient. Okay, so here, let me begin then. Right. So by looking at the title and the abstract, you must have by now arrived at certain assumptions about hunting in colonial India. Among the assumptions, at the risk of being a mind reader, may I point out that there is a strong Marxist tendency of looking at hunting or shikar in terms of resource use. Environmental historians consider shikar as an extension of their thesis on the imperial exploitation of non-European resources. The term imperial in this phrase, imperial exploitation of non-European resources, can be substituted with capitalistic, greedy, irresponsible, and unethical. Now, this sort of reading plays along with a post-colonial and, dare I say, a nationalistic reading of imperial culture. By this reading, imperial culture was predatorial and vampirish because it preyed on non-European nations and sought to smother the natural social development of the colonized nation. To the scholars who approach hunting academically, 2 very influential approaches on hunting are: 1, hunting as a manifestation of man's fight with wilderness. In an imperial climate, hunting is a white man's effort to combat the threat of wilderness and establish the rule of civilization. Scholars like Matt Cartmill, Harriet Ridfo, and of course John Mackenzie have developed a genealogy of man's imperial contact with nature. And number two is from the perspective of social Darwinism. Historically, hunting has been associated with humans' access to hunting as sports. So the upper classes have always hedged in game and have controlled access to game. And upper classes have always developed a narrative that if you can hunt using a particular method, then you become part of a better class of human beings. Okay? So these are the different approaches available to us the moment we start thinking about hunting. Now, at the very outset of this talk, I would like to freeze the environmental and the nationalistic perspectives. Now, as to the other two approaches, one, hunting as manifestation of man's fight with wilderness, and the concept of social Darwinism, we must realize that hunting narratives will have to pit man against nature. So there is in no way you can freeze those perspectives. And we must also acknowledge that the colonizers' hunting method will always be considered better than that of the colonized. Hunting, to begin with, always maintains class structures. Now, let me come to a very naive way of looking at today's talk. And let me whet your WH appetites. By that I mean, let me answer the WH questions. For example, who am I? Why this topic? How did I come across this topic? Well, some of my friends here I know, I'm studying Shikar narratives since 2008. My MPhil and PhD on British hunting cultures in India have landed me with a plethora of ideas, theories, and texts about hunting. I'm interested in this topic not merely as a historian, but as a literature student and as an enthusiast in cultural aesthetics. Now, let me inform you that I am interested in genealogies of scholarly thinking, and I spent fruitful hours trying to theorize, quote unquote, the concept of personal in my PhD days, only to be snubbed in the end for being too personal. Today, I have started with some of my friends a kind of collective called Archive Collective, where we try to digest Jacques Derrida's feverish notions about intellectual genealogy as cohortative and sometimes Oedipal. Why I am saying these things to you? I would want you to be aware of the fact that while we read Shikar narratives, we will notice Oedipal tensions of rivalry, swagger, anger, feverishness, ambiguous sense of inheritance, and you would also see obsessions with the rituals of everyday life. And this is exactly something that pointed out in my abstract, that in the hunting narratives that I have looked at throughout the 19th century, you find British hunters and also other hunters constantly repeating certain rituals. They repeat it in such an obsessive manner, this obsessive love for violence, blood, and gore is a kind of a manic display of love for the daily rituals of everyday life. And if violence, gore, and dangerous risk-taking had become part of everyday life of an imperial person in the 19th century. So let me go back to the first to the slide that I'm showing you. I'm still telling you why we are studying Shikar. Now, as I'm telling you about studying Shikar, I was asked this question a number of times during my PhD days as well, that by looking at Shikar, that by freezing nationalistic and environmental perspectives, probably I'm trying to sanitize imperialism. My answer is no. By freezing established perspectives and by dwelling on aesthetics, I don't believe I am sanitizing imperial culture. In a way, let me sound fashionable, in a kind of Gayatri Spivak-like. Let me consider freezing as strategic, explained with a swagger so that I can keep delaying a point of proper beginning for my lecture and invite you to be engaged in a humorous play of academic procrastination. However, I'll not procrastinate anymore. I will quickly draw your attention to the title of my topic. The title of my topic, as you might know right now, is The Imperial Romance of Shikar, Hunting in India in the early 19th century. The first question that you can ask is, what is imperial romance? Well, there is a long list of emotions and cultural tendencies that are associated with it. And I'm referring to writers like Patrick Brantlinger and Linda Dryden, who have made a huge list of ideas that are associated with imperial romance. Escapism, adventure, fascination with mystery, violence, fascination with horror, fascination with exotic locations, geographical exploration, and of course, celebration of the self in an exotic location. Finally, a sense of wonder and a love for virile physical activities. All these become part of imperial romance narratives. You can think of Rider Haggard, G.A. Henty, and many other writers who were extremely popular during the late Victorian period. I contend always, when I talk about hunting cultures, that hunting or shikar culture in India absorbed and inherited all the tendencies of imperial romance. And the literary productions addressing this romance emerged in the early 19th century. Most important of these books being William Blaine's An Account of the Hunting Excursions of Asaf-ud-Dawla. This was published in 1788, along with a poem written by Augustus Somerville, who was a very popular poet then. And the poem is also a very popular poem in those days about hunting. The poem was titled The Chase. It was about hare hunting. So one of the first books to come out was William Blaine's An Account of the Hunting Excursions of Asaf-ud-Dawla, 1788. It coincides more or less with the beginnings of the Romantic Age, quote unquote, Romantic Age in English literature or English letters. Asaf-ud-Dawla happened to be the ruler of Oudh. The second most important book coming out in this Romantic period was, of course, Thomas Williamson's Oriental Field Sports. And I will talk about Oriental Field Sports in the end of this talk. Also, James Forbes ended up writing his memoirs. James Forbes was a very famous painter, and he roamed around in India during the late 18th century and ended up writing his two-volume memoir. The memoirs were published in 1813, titled as Oriental Memoirs. And of course, in 1827, Daniel Johnson ended up writing Sketches of Indian Field Sports. Daniel Johnson was an apothecary, or kind of a doctor, who had come to India because he was hired by the East India Company to work in India. An important part of my title today is the term shikar. You must be wondering why I'm choosing this title, this word shikar, instead of hunting. Well, shikar, the Hindi term for hunting, highlights the hybrid nature of colonial hunting activities in India. Shikar necessitated collaboration with the native hunters, servants, and guides. For Europeans hunting in India, it also meant adopting already existing Mughal hunting practices, like hunting from atop an elephant. Hobson Jobson, a historical dictionary of Anglo-Indian terms published in 1886, lists shikar as an Anglo-Indian term adopted from Persian. Okay, so I repeat, the hybrid nature of colonial hunting activities. Now, let me give you a taste of what this imperial romance was like. I have been writing a monograph on hunting narratives and hunting culture in colonial India for a while, and I will read from that for a while. So I'm going to tell you stories about wildlife encounters in early 19th century in Lower Bengal and how that affected the British culture and how that affected colonial life. Anuparna, is it okay? Am I audible? Is everything okay? Am I audible?
Yes, you're
Oh,
not.
yes. Right. Yeah, I'll go ahead.
But your picture is frozen, Rajarshi.
My picture is frozen. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll just, because probably I'm presenting, that's why.
But we cannot see your presentation.
It's visible to me, Anuparna. It might be your computer.
No, it's a picture. Okay. It's fine now.
Yeah.
It's fine now? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I will just read from what I have been writing about encounters in Lower Bengal. So I'll take you to 1796. And by now, 1790s, Calcutta had become a very important seaport. There are several Europeans living in Calcutta, and it has more or less divided itself geographically into a white town and a native black town. And this is what happens on August 25, 1796. The Calcutta Gazette, an English daily published from Calcutta, reported that Mr. Isaac Abraham, an Armenian Jew, had a melancholy encounter with a royal male tiger of an extraordinary size in an indigo plantation near the city. Upon receiving the news of tiger from the villagers, he had set off at once for the indigo field. He was accompanied by a retinue of 50 coolies and barkandazis, who are the constables, carrying matchlocks, sticks, and spears. The retinue approached cautiously when they spotted the beast. Mr. Abraham ordered others not to fire until he gave a signal. He took the first shot from his matchlock, which wounded the tiger. Being irritated and in panic, the animal issued forth from its cover and charged. All the coolies and barkandazis ran away in fear. The tiger attacked. The tiger attacked a young boy who was part of the retinue. Mr. Isaac, while trying to rescue the boy, ended up distracting the tiger towards himself. The animal leapt on him and wounded him mortally. Suffering greatly from a severe shoulder wound, he was brought to Calcutta, where he breathed his last. Now, incidents like the above, or the one that I just narrated, were commonly reported in the English dailies of Bengal in the late 18th century.
Rajarshi, just to interrupt you, sorry to interrupt you. Do you have a presentation right now, or is it a blank screen?
It's a blank screen. Okay. I don't know why it's a blank screen.
Are you presenting something? Because it's not visible to us.
It's not visible. Should I? Okay. I've stopped presenting and I will try again.
Right.
Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is visible now.
Okay. So yeah, just for everybody, I'm done with the first three points that I have been telling you. I am explaining to you how Shikar was in the what Shikar culture might mean in the early 19th century. I'm on fourth point actually.
Yeah.
Right. I'll go back to what I was doing. Right. Incidents like the one I just pointed out were commonly reported in the English dailies of Bengal in the late 18th century. But none was more famous than the death of Munro inside the dense mangrove forests of the Sagar Island in Lower Bengal on December 21, 1792. I would want you to look at this next slide for a while. This is exactly what happened when a young Mr. Munro was enjoying the environs. A tiger came out of the bush, leapt on him, and took him away, and he died. Let's see what happens immediately after that. So none was more famous than the death of Munro inside the dense mangrove forests of the Sagar Island in Lower Bengal on December 21, 1792. The island was in the Sundarbans, a sprawling mangrove cover located at the mouth of the river Hooghly, which flew through the colonial metropolis of Calcutta. Ships leaving the Calcutta harbor invariably had to pass by small harbors located along the forest in the Sundarbans. A tiger attacked and killed one of the members of the European crew of Shaw Ardasir, a vessel bound for Madras, when they had ventured on an excursion inside the forest in Sagar Island. In full view of other European gentlemen, the tiger leapt on and carried away an unaware young man named Hector Sutherland Munro. Now, he happened to be the adopted son of the hero of the Second Anglo-Mysore War, Sir Hector Munro. His father's name was Sir Hector Munro, and the son, whose name was Hector Sutherland Munro, was carried away by the tiger. This immediately became a widely reported incident throughout the British Empire. Magazines, eager to grow business and attract overseas readers, transformed this incident into an imperial struggle between a European man and a non-European animal. The Sporting Review, which was only a year old, reported eyewitness accounts of the incident with illustrations showing the English gentleman being unaware of a crouching tiger in the lush thickets behind Munro. Poems lamented the death of young Munro, but praised the imperial zeal of his heroic father, who could continue conquest and enterprise, notwithstanding personal tragedy. In Mysore, Tipu Sultan, the formidable opponent of the East India Company, exploited the incident to expand his arsenal of tigerish images, architecture, and ephemera. He immediately commissioned the famous musical toy Tipu's Tiger, now in Victoria and Albert Museum, showing a tiger eating a prostrate English soldier. If played properly, the toy imitates the guttural sound of the tiger and the agonies of a human in distress. Along with this toy, when the English looted Tipu's palace after the Third Anglo-Mysore War in 1799, they came across voluminous artifacts with similar tiger motifs. For Tipu, tiger was a symbol of royalty, kinship, power, divine blessing, and revenge. For the British, it was a romantic symbol for a rapacious Oriental despot, undaunted and heroic in his defeat. Since the day the looted toy went on display in 1806, it has fascinated the visitors. It inspired the Staffordshire Pearl, inspired the Staffordshire pearl wire figures of 1810 that display a variety of tiger soldier arrangements. It shows how the incident of the death of Munro passed on from imperial lore to literary culture to consumer culture and finally to imperial commemoration in British public life. Narratives like the Tipu's tiger open up a number of windows to the colonial hunting culture of the 18th century. It adumbrates the discourses, networks, and spaces colonial hunting in India would generate. It informs discourses of imperial natural history, conquest, governance, and commodity trade. Hunting exists within an array of dense social networks that company officials and Europeans engage themselves in. Tipu's tiger further establishes the networks of affect that human-animal interaction was to be part of in colonial India. Now, back in Calcutta, which had become the headquarters of the British East India Company since the 1770s, the Europeans and Indians lived in close proximity to wild animals. Memoirs and regular columns in newspapers by European settlers from Calcutta in the late 18th century reveal constant and bitter efforts to fight and improve the moist tropical environment. Possibly, the economic prosperity of the company lent a positivist strain to these memoirs. East India Company officials recollected their Calcutta days by narrating long experiences of hunting wild beasts of all sorts. Small animals like jackals, civets, and dangerous snakes were regularly trapped and killed. The defeat of Tipu Sultan and the discovery of his tigerish arsenal became part of this lived reality, where imperial triumph was measured against daily fights with tropical beasts. British prisoners tortured by Tipu Sultan compared his evil designs with the savageness of tigers. What informed their knowledge of tigers was their personal experience, colored either by Buffon's notes about the tiger in his encyclopedic volume on natural history, or by Thomas Bewick's A General History of the Quadrupeds. Published in the decade of public fascination with tropical tigers' challenge to British imperial designs, William Blake's popular poem, The Tiger, 1794, used available knowledge about the beast from the colonies. Reginald Heber, the Bishop of Calcutta from 1832 till his death from Calcutta, produces the mood of Europeans living densely in a city surrounded by jungles and beasts. And this is the poem that he writes. Come walk with me the jungle through, if yonder hunter told us true, far off in desert dank and rude, the tiger holds its solitude. Nor, taught by recent harm to shun, the thunders of the English gun, a dreadful guest but rarely seen, returns to scare the village green. Come boldly on, no venomed snake can shelter in so cool a brake. Heber's poem provides the tropes that frame my talk on hunting in India, at a time when the Indian Empire was gradually becoming a stable imperial possession for the British East India Company. Revenue was pouring in from the city and the rich agricultural lands around it. Yet, the company had to constantly push for more revenue through various land settlements and land reclamation schemes to fund the many wars it was fighting in the subcontinent. This constant push made them confront a variety of forests and wildlife in Bengal and in other parts of India. Just to give you a brief idea of how writers were writing about other parts of India, early explorations undertaken by the East India Company were coordinated by Lord Clive, who rose to become the Governor General of Bengal. He appointed explorers like James Rennell as Surveyor General of Bengal to produce maps of different parts of the newly acquired British dominions. Rennell's Memoirs of a Map of Hindustan, 1788, is filled with references to natural scenery and wildlife. In fact, the evidence gathered from a number of travel and exploration memoirs from the 18th century characterize the nature of intense mobility Europeans indulged in. Explorers in Bombay Presidency frequently came across tigers and other wildlife during their trips to Nagpur and Sambalpur. James Forbes, an artist and a writer for the East India Company in Surat in Western India, recorded in his Oriental memoirs the plush wildlife he saw during his excursions. Forbes, who stayed in India from 1765 to 1784, accompanied the English chiefs of the company in their hunting trips deep inside the Gujarat forests. From the account of wildlife encounters in early 19th century Lower Bengal, you must have sensed the intense porosity of existence. The existence, I repeat, was extremely porous. The settlers and the British and the Europeans and others who were living in Calcutta and in other parts of India were constantly open to different influences. And this readily distinguishes them from the later day imperialists who were living within very closed boundaries and within very close knit communities. Okay. So I repeat that from the account of the wildlife encounters in early 19th century Lower Bengal, you must have sensed the intense porosity of their existence. It took another few years for Thomas Williamson to establish wildlife encounters as a kind of a blood sport, as a proper sports. And his book became extremely popular. Romantic poets who were writing about the Orient, as I told you some time back, did use him as a reference in their poems. Robert Southey uses it in The Curse of Kehama. So I come to the final part of my talk today, where I talk briefly about how Thomas Williamson decided to write Wild Sports of the East, or Oriental Field Sports. His actual book has a long title. From that long title, we either refer to the book as Oriental Field Sports or as Wild Sports of the East. So the final part of my talk today is writing Wild Sports of the East. Thomas George Williamson, a versatile talent, spent upwards of 20 years of his life working in the army of the East India Company in Bengal. He returned to England in 1798 and tried to establish himself as a writer, publishing his Shikar tome in 1808, which inaugurated a new genre. You can consider this as the Anglo-Indian hunting narratives, or as Mr. Williamson himself referred to, Oriental Shikar tales. At this point, I would want you to look at, just a minute, the first page from his book. I hope most of you can see this. This is the first page of his book. The melancholy tiger that you see, I hope this is visible. This melancholy tiger occurs on the first page of Oriental Field Sports. You can immediately sense how romantic aesthetics was being used to depict Shikar tales. The idea of a picturesque world and the idea of animals who are extremely emotional. In fact, Thomas Williamson's Oriental Field Sports clearly revealed that he believed in the emotional existence of animals. But of course, it was not as radical as to suggest that humans and animals are more or less the same. It was not very radical, but he completely, the way he was writing, he kind of, and the picture that you can see, they completely accepted that animals were emotional beings. So he was hunting emotional beings. Okay. Right. Now, the book Oriental Field Sports was a very attractive one. It was published in 2 volumes with several colorful plates like the one you are looking at right now, and it ran for several editions with a shorter version coming out as late as in 1892. His other publications, Williamson's other publications, include The Complete Angler's Vaidmekam, The East India Vaidmekam, 1810, a kind of novel, The Dominican. Very strangely, a book which he published in 1808 was titled Mathematics Simplified and Practically Illustrated. And finally, in 1813, he ended up writing a book that would be used by different East India Company officials later on, The European in India. This, along with another book published in 1810, The East India Vaidmekam, became books that exploited the market of new recruits to the East India Company. These were meant for them, how to live in India and how to have a good life in India. That was how these books were written. So what would be your leisure practices? What are the people you should hire? Who are the people you should hire? What sort of people you should associate himself with? How would you make money? How would you borrow money, etc. Now, Mr. Williamson was a very talented man. He had, in fact, published some music compositions and probably was one among the first to publish transcriptions of Indian music. He published these in 1800. In 1798, a significant year for literary scholars, of course, Williamson went through a very bad phase. He had an unceremonious exit from military service in India when he was court-martialed for writing a letter to the editor of the Telegraph, published from Calcutta, strongly criticizing Lord Cornwallis's decision to implement reforms within the army hierarchy in India. He was hired as an army official in India, and he was criticizing the same establishment and had published that letter. And he was immediately chucked out. Forced to choose a new lifestyle after this humiliating episode, Williamson's urge to become a polymath was possibly more a necessity than a casual fling. His various publications reveal his constant need to return to the English social life by proving his abilities as a gentleman writer capable of using imagination and learning. In his publications, he keeps mentioning his anxiety over the usefulness of his work. To counter this anxiety, he often invokes the pleasure of reading a work composed in intimate language. Intimacy in his works appears as a narrative strategy to construct a tone that would instruct, inform, and please the reader. Like his tone, he varies his sympathies deftly to match the social class of his target readers. Williamson's work on Oriental sports should not be isolated from his oeuvre, which, along with 2 Vaidmekam books, includes an anti-Jacobin romance. His Vaidmekams, and this anti-Jacobin romance was kind of a novel about how an aristocratic family was running away from persecution in France. I will briefly tell you what his book on the East India Vaidmekam was like, because that book is connected to Oriental field sports. His Vaidmekams are precursors to Victorian how-to books on manners, industry, and self-help. Intertextual connections between his The East India Vaidmekam, 1810, and his hunting book are quite obvious, as one complements the other. In his Vaidmekam, Williamson even advertises his superb work on the details of every branch of hunting, shooting, and etc. As a supplementary reading for, as the complete title of the guidebook suggests, gentlemen intended for civil, military, or naval service for the Honorable East India Company. aim to exploit new interest among English men for a career in the East, these books offer ready access to rituals of Anglo-Indian life in India. A detailed list of suggestions offered in the guidebook ranges from refrigeration of food during summer months to selecting proper elephant for traveling to native customs, Indian measurement standards, and various ways of self-preservation during summer, monsoon, or a sudden snake bite. The book serves two purposes. First, it dispels myths about an Indian career and prepares the reader for hard realities of running an empire. Second, it is a code of conduct to apprise the Englishman on behavior expected from Europeans as a ruling caste in colonial India. The guide, published as early as 1810, clearly records the beginning of solidification of European attitude towards India. It serves as a warning to those who might deviate from established rules of social communication. The anxiety of going native, of not being able to maintain social difference with the natives, is a subtext which underlies this guidebook. However, the Vedmekam lacks, neither does it recommend, a sense of absolute difference with India. Rather, it promotes a hybrid existence, connecting to Indian customs with a panache and adaptability only the Nabobs and white Mughals were capable of. Now, compared to a very narrow target readership of the Vedmekam, Oriental field sports aimed for readers with varied tastes. This sports book expected its readers to recognize how it was exchanging textual dialogues with various other genre books available to a contemporary gentleman of learning. The preface mentions sportsmen, naturalists, historians, artists, and philosophers as intended readers of his work, because it is offered to curious observer of nature to feel equal transport in contemplating that part of her works which is appropriated to other soils. Which she has appropriated to other soils. It should also be read by an artist to adorn his composition with beauties, and by philosophers and historians to correct their conceptions. At this point, I would stop, and before I conclude, I just want to bring all my thoughts together. I have been explaining to you that in the early 19th century, writers and the British settlers who were pursuing hunt lived an extremely hybrid existence. They lived a reality which was extremely porous, and this porosity was a kind of a cultural porosity where they were very open to Indian influences. Shikar, I have been trying to show you, was part of this Indian influence that they embraced. Before it became a widely popular sports in the late 19th century and the middle 19th century as well, in the early 19th century, it showed not only personal enterprise, but the beginning of a sort of social blending with India. As to the way the Englishman would socially blend with India would be constantly redefined throughout the century. But the hunters started believing that by hunting, they were blending and interacting with India in a way that others could not. Right here, I would like to conclude. I would like to say that hunting became a widely popular sport in colonial India as well as the British Empire right after the 1820s. It enabled social communication among the colonizers and a method of collaboration with the colonized. That is how the hunters looked at it. Hunters looked at it as a method of collaboration. Right after 1820s, a range of pig-sticking clubs emerged all over India. I have looked at their journals, and their journals reveal a very cozy masculine bonhomie between the different pig stickers all over India. There are numerous references to collaborations with Indians And it seems to present hunting as a kind of an ideal cultural activity of imperialism. But definitely, this boom in Shikar culture in India meant that there was a huge depletion of game. And right here, the environmental historian sets in. The moment we start looking at the resource use patterns, we realize that by the end of the 19th century, a range of conservation laws and the establishment of the Forest Service proved that there was a huge anxiety over depletion of game. Game was now unavailable. In the hunting narratives of the late 19th century, Indians were denigrated, criticized, because they were not following the ethics of hunting. They were killing around, and they were the cause of depletion of game. That was how the late 19th century books started referring to Indians. But the early 19th century was a vision of settlement, porosity, and extreme forms of mobility and romance with the empire. With that, I end my talk. I hope I made some sense. You can ask me questions.
So thank you, Rajarshi, for this very fascinating, very informative, talk. So I'll open the house to question. You can actually, unmute your mic and just kind of ask it yourself, or you can type the question in the question box in the chat box. We can take that from there as well. So yes, I have a couple of questions, but before that, I'll simply, let others speak. Okay, so I'll give the others a few minutes to kind of, put together their questions. So I'll begin with a very basic one. So you pointed out this, this realization in the colonial hunters about the affective or the emotive, life of the animals. So that this melancholy tiger, that, tigers also, animals also have certain emotions. But this is also the time when, we could see a transition from, hunting for survival or to, hunting for sports. So was there any tension, any ethical dilemma, when they realized that, animals are killing, beasts with certain emotions? So was there, do we really see any ethical dilemma at this point of time? About hunting?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for asking that question, actually. There's a lovely British tradition of scholars. Okay, there's a lovely British scholarship about how British ethical ideas changed about animals, and writers point out that it was the Romantic period from where human beings, or at least the upper class who were reading literature, started realizing that animals were emotional beings. In fact, in 1824, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animal was established in Britain. This, however, does not go with the fact that all over the world, including in Britain, wherever Europeans went, they were establishing hunting clubs and they were developing and evolving hunting practices, from new kind of weapons to new kind of prey, new kind of game animals that they were looking for. All this happened during this period. One of the writers, to understand this paradox, probably, one of the writers, John Mackenzie, he says that the fascination with emotional animals went hand in hand with fascination for gore and violence. So when you become very violent and you kill animals, the very fact that you can sense animals being very emotionally reacting to that violence is something that everyone enjoyed. This was one of the ways by which John Mackenzie decided to reflect on these developments. However, none of the hunting narratives or the hunters themselves referred to the sense of conscience or the sense of or a sense of love for the animals, or a sense of cruelty towards animals. None of the hunters do think that hunting is cruel, at this point at least. Much later, especially you might think of George Orwell, much later, who would consider hunting as a very cruel activity. But at this point, hunting was considered a very natural activity and a very common way of dealing with animals. Yeah, Anuparna.
Yeah,
At least
that
I
is
have not
quite
found
clear. Yeah,
any
yeah.
hunter reflecting on cruelty towards animals.
But that's true. But thinking along this line, and you pointed this out, it occurred to me that whenever I have read, these hunting narratives, be it in early British India, for that matter, in the late colonial period, one thing that came, even though there were these hunting for sports or pot hunting and other forms of hunting, but by and large, even in Orwell for that matter, the British figure, whenever they, you have these hunters, they justify this act of hunting as a savior figure. They turn up to save the villagers. They're doing it for the local population. But
Yeah,
whereas you have these Indian kings and nababs who kind of ruthlessly murder, they do it for sports, and they don't have any accountability, which also I believe got reflected in these conservation laws and the breach of conservation laws
yeah,
and the way they were interpreted. The responsibility, the onus of ruthless killing was by and large laid upon the Indian counterparts rather than on the British, because they always, the Corbett stories, like even Corbett, the hunter is always a savior figure more than anything else.
right.
But then, yeah, I'll open the house to other questions.
Yeah, actually, I had a
Yes,
question
please.
related to it that I was thinking about, which was, sorry, there's some strange noise in the background. Yeah, which was,
Let me unmute. Let me mute myself.
no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So I had a question actually about the issue of class, and how this hunting as sport. So given that hunting as sport was a very sort of upper class activity in Britain, and in fact mostly for people belonging to the royal family, and then by the 19th century, actually they tried to sort of make it more common, even in Britain. But if I sort of understood correctly, but you can correct me, of course. But then when they came to India, was it a way for them to establish both their inroads in terms of friendship with the upper classes out here, and to establish them as a kind of in front of the populace, as somebody in control of this level of violence and power, which they can show in this whole ritual of the Shikar. So I was wondering, how it played in their sort of establishment as the ruling class, also aesthetically, as you said, within the minds of the Indian populace. So I was wondering about that.
Sure. Yeah. Should I respond?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, thank you for the question. Let me put it this way. This is something that I pointed out towards the very beginning of my talk, that the moment you start thinking of Shikar without the concept of resource use, without thinking of social Darwinism, new avenues start opening up. And I believe that, of course, many of these British young men who were traveling to India did not belong to the upper classes. They come here, and in India, many of them, especially in the early 19th century, find that they have access to resources which they never had back in Britain. So yes, there is a huge showing off going on, definitely. About showing off of power, that is a given. The moment you think of hunting, the moment you think of killing animals, you show off who is in control. That is a given. But what I would also like to point out is that at this point, especially in 19th century, most of these young gentlemen were following the way Mughals and local noblemen hunted in India. And they were hunting using the same weapons. They were hunting using the same collaborators or the same forms of hunting all over India. Take, for example, a man like William Beale, who gets an invitation to accompany Asaf-ud-Dawla, who is a vizier of Oudh. And he says that I liked the entire hunting episode, but the most important thing that I liked was that the fact that Vizier allowed me to be very close to him. The moment he says that, you realize that most of these English gentlemen hunting here were becoming attuned, or in a way enjoying, the strange class structures that hunting could bring about in India. In or during hunting, you can become very close to local noblemen. Therefore, for at least for the moment of the hunting, for the time of the hunting, the sense of you being part of a different class or a lower class kind of disappears. So when they write about hunting, they write about hunting as a kind of an escapism, as a form where you can escape your class and your class boundaries sometimes. And it's a very strange way by which they write. I'm not sure if I have answered your question correctly.
Actually, you answered exactly my question. This was my question about, where they're trying to establish, and also to feel this kind of bonhomie with the upper classes of India, and in that way establish themselves as the upper class in India.
Absolutely. They felt that they were the ruling caste, and that is exactly the kind of swagger which I pointed out in my talk, that the class swagger is very much part of what they are writing. Yes.
Yeah, great. So that's exactly what that is.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a very, very interesting point, this extending of the camaraderie, and then kind of in order to make certain inroads into the Indian society. So kind of this, because most of these hunting narratives as we get, particularly the ones for pleasure and sports, were always a collaborative activity, often carried out with Indian rulers. That's what we get most of the times. But we have a question from Antara. Antara, please.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. So the first was about the way in which nature, like you were saying that at that stage there were no, we do not see any evidence of hunters thinking along lines of cruelty or ethicality in the activity. So what underlying views of nature or the animal or the wilderness then can we locate in this kind of practice when it is taken up as a sport? And the other was you emphasized how hunting in the early 19th century was what you described as hybrid and porous, and it was collaborative and inclusive, and they saw it as a way of interacting with and embracing the Indian cultural modes. So I was interested to know how this trajectory kind of develops and departs from this earlier model in the later 19th century, for example. Do we see it going on a different kind of trajectory? Does it become more exclusivist? So these were my questions.
Yeah, thank you for both the questions. So I'll answer the first one. I'll try to respond to the first one. You can also give me some more inputs about this. First is, how do they look at nature? I think that's how the hunters were thinking about nature. One of the major frameworks of this period was picturesque. and picturesque was a very established form of literature during this period. And this is available in most of the romantic poets as well. They were looking at nature through the concept of picturesque. Now, the picturesque had a list of features that you are supposed to follow in order to enjoy nature. You are supposed to render something picturesque, not that the nature is picturesque. You have to render something picturesque. And it is upon the eye, this is how William Gilpin and others decided to write about picturesque. It is upon the eye of the individual to transform nature into something picturesque. If I can make you think of Daffodils, for example, it's a very popular poem by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth does exactly that. He says he's transforming nature, or what he sees in his nature, using his internal eye. And that is often used in our literature as a kind of a romantic formula. However, picturesque was so popular as a mode of looking at nature, and that included the moment you look at nature, you have to look for the rugged terrain. The moment you look at nature, you have to look for the wild beauties. The moment you look at nature, you have to think of the mellow colors, and you have to think of how to render nature mellow. You cannot use high colors. The moment you think of nature, you have to think of different aspects of nature. So there should not be a straight line. Nature should always be present to you in rugged lines. There was a huge list by which you can look at and experience nature. And this we can consider as picturesque formula. There are quite a few books on this as well. So I believe, and my reading of the Shikar memoirs or narratives show that they were following this picturesque formula to interact with nature. So that is how I would like to respond to it. You can also, tell me if you have some other thoughts in mind about this. I'm still looking for good inputs on this. And number two, I think you asked me a question about how the concept of being very porous, being very open to Indian influences started changing. Well, wonder of wonders, the boom in hunting narratives occurs after 1857. Now, if you are thinking about 1857 historically, 1857 was kind of a watershed period, which many historians consider to be a period when the entire aesthetics by which the British were looking at India underwent several changes. It is very well illustrated, very strangely, when you look at the hunting narratives and the hunting tradition. A range of books, think of Mr. Baker, Edward Moray Brown, you name it, most of these books started getting published after 1857. And when they start publishing these books show a more managerial attention paid to Shikar. Shikar was now more about a young gentleman following certain codes. You saw that in Oriental field sports as well. You saw some bits and pieces of that in Oriental field sports as well. But it completely solidifies by it comes to the late 19th century. There are clear recommendations of how to manage a hunt. So hunting becomes a kind of management exercise for a British man or a British woman. There are quite a few mem sahibs who start hunting in the late 19th century. This includes the kind of weapons. Instructions include the way of weapons you might use, the kind of weapons you have to use, the kind of attire you might wear. The most important change that happens after 1857 is that hunting now becomes a very touristic activity, very touristic. And in many of these manuals, hunting manuals, there is a huge list of local guides provided, and the kind of money that they might charge to help you hunt, you can by now realize that the early 19th century did not have this management ethics or a strong economic element to it. This management ethics becomes, or kind of a very capitalistic touristic ethics appears after 1857 in the hunting narratives. It might be different in other traditions. That's how I would like to respond. I hope I've responded it properly.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for the responses. So very interesting kind of conceptualization of hunting, as you put it, as a managerial activity. So
Yes.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, so from this, do we have? I have another question, so related to Antara's question. I wanted to extend that, but before that, do we have any other questions from the audience?
And
we can take?
yeah, just kind of taking off from what Rajarshi said in response to my question, I was also kind of very interested in knowing about the gender dynamics, because it is so associated with cultures of masculinity. That you mentioned that there were also Mem Sahibs who were participating, and if you could elaborate on that a bit and how it
yeah. Just to add to Antara's question again, I mean to tag along with Antara's question here, since she brought in the gender questions, we also had this royal princesses, along with the Mimsai, we also had these royal princesses who would go for hunting. So, I mean, what about them as well? I mean, because otherwise, these families were very conservative, but then we do have instances of princesses going out with a huge retinue, to hunt. So could you just kind of tell us something about the gender dynamic? Yeah.
Okay, I'll first tell you about the gender dimension and then about the local princess or the Indian princess. So one, about the gender dimension, definitely any imperial hunting is looked upon as a kind of an hyper-masculine exercise. But when I start looking at the gender, and there are quite a few writers like Joseph Stremick and others who have analyzed the hyper-masculinity involved in virile sports like hunting, rather imperial hunting. But I think what attracted my attention was the risk-taking abilities of most of these hunters. There's a very famous incident that occurred sometime, I think, in 1840s, when a man named Mr. Campbell, who was a very important official, decided to, he had wounded a tiger, and the tiger was hiding in the bush. He was afraid of going inside the bush because the tiger might charge. His friends encourage him to go into the bush. He goes into the bush and the tiger charges, and that's the last day of his shikar. He never goes to hunt anymore. He's badly mauled. In 1882, or I think somewhere around 1882, 1885, Joseph Ferrer, who was a very famous physician, ended up writing a book titled The Royal Tiger of Bengal, where, as a physician, he listed the number of wounds or the number of injuries he had treated in the last, I think, 10, 12 years of his stay in India. And that made me think that the British body, male body especially, even though it was considered very porous towards the very beginning, and then gradually it became a bit more fortified, the moment it was taking risks as a hyper-masculine exercise, it was opening itself up to injuries and wounds. And I would like to look upon Shikar, and most of the Shikaris, British Shikaris, sportsmen, got badly wounded during Shikar. at one point or the other in their life, and they've had very narrow escapes. The risk-taking was becoming part of this masculine exercise, and getting wounded was also becoming normalized. That is how I started looking at, that is how I would like to look at this entire hyper-masculine activity of Shikar. There was a lot of swagger, there was a lot of, uh, there was a sense, especially in the pig-sticking songs, that the men have come together to form a culture where women were not present, thankfully. Most of the songs appreciate man's physical prowess, but behind it, I would like to read it as a kind of a risk-taking exercise where wounding or getting wounded was normalized. That is how I look at this gender dimension. The other gender dimension is the mem sahibs. I have come across some mem sahibs who, and they have written their memoirs as well, but mem sahibs were often surrounded by quite a retinue of servants who were saving her. That is how I have found. There is one lady whom I found, I don't know if she was writing this up as a kind of fictitious element, of whether this was fictitious or real. This lady was, she was very badly wounded during Shikar. And apart from her, other mem sahibs do not refer to this concept of getting wounded. They somehow probably doesn't go with their Victorian standards, writing about getting wounded. But men do. Men love writing about getting wounded and getting injured. So that's how I would look at the gender dimension. The next one is the Nabob dimension, or the Nawab, or the local prince dimension of Shikar. The local princes were hunting all the time. That is a very different culture altogether. When the local princes were hunting, they were following a tradition that was established in Mughal India and even before that in the Delhi Sultanate. And this hunting culture was an extremely different culture from that of the British culture. The British culture gave a lot of importance to the individual hunter, who was managing, who was developing methods, who was pursuing a game on foot and taking risks and getting injured. There was a lot of attention paid to that body. Whereas when it comes to writing about the princess and the way the princess imagined themselves, it was always about how hunting was a kind of a fairground, a kind of a mela. And this was hunting, the Mrigaya, as they called it, Mrigaya, was a kind of a place, kind of a Facebook of 19th century, a place where all of them could come together and communicate socially. Killing the animal was often very incidental. However, these traditions began interacting with the British traditions of hunting. And yes, when the British started coming to the princely states to hunt, there was a strange mixture of these two practices. That would kind of require another lecture. It's a very, very strange practice that happens in late 19th century. But early 19th century, they were still practicing the old Mughal technique of hunting as a kind of a mela shikar, as they call it.
But still a little more curious. I mean, why did the Mem Sahibs take up hunting at all? You have read those memoirs. So given that it's a very masculine sport, so what was kind of, what was working in their mind when they sort of decided to kind of, partake in this kind of risk-taking? So if you could kind of elaborate. And Antara, you have something more to add. Please add.
No, I just wanted to say that I just wanted to thank Rajarshi for his response.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, Anuparna, you were asking me something.
Yeah, I did ask you that, what kind of prompted these women, the Mem Sahibs, to kind of, participate in this kind of very masculinist, hyper-masculine sports, because, in the first place. So that was my question. So you have read those memoirs, because that was, as you said, it was not very usual initially. But then we do have these figures coming up who would talk about this, hunting expeditions where they participated personally. So yes, yeah.
Well, I can tell you about two Mem Sahibs right now, and you will understand why they were taking up. One was Fanny Parks, who decided to be part of, who was not exactly a hunter, but
Yeah.
she came to India in the 1830s, I think, and she was off and on. She was visiting India, and she fell in love with India. And she was learned Indian languages. She was hunting because she found herself her husband was working in India, and she was not one of the upper classes. She was not a viceroy's wife, so she was very open to Indian influences. And it so happened that everyone hunted around her, and she felt that she needed to hunt as well. Now, very strangely, an Indian woman at that stage would not have ever felt like hunting. But this British woman, who was a Mem Sahib in India, could actually get social support to hunt. And there goes a new discourse about how Mem Sahibs were being looked upon in India in the 19th century. There are various ways by which they were looked upon, but very strangely, I found that Fanny Parks writes clearly that she was getting enough social support to hunt, and that's why she hunted, because people around her helped her. Now, when it comes to another lady, Isabel Savory, who was hunting, and she was a traveler, she came to India for the sole purpose of hunting. She was hunting because she was a sportswoman. And she was a sportswoman because she was part of a wider, I think, pan-imperial white movement about women's suffrage, about women's rights, etc. So Isabel Savory looked at hunting as a kind of a women's rights question. So you get these two different discourses as well when it comes to Mem Sahib's hunting. There are other Mem Sahibs who felt hunting was akin to another form of sports like badminton and other kinds of sports, and they wanted to explore it.
Quite fascinating, actually. Yeah, when Fanny Parks herself is a very fascinating woman. I mean, given the activities, the things that she carried out, so she's one of a kind, actually.
Yeah,
Now,
she's one of a
yeah,
kind.
yeah. We have a question from Purbita. Purbita, do you want to say it?
Actually, there are a couple of questions
Yeah, I
on
could
the
see.
chat box.
Purbita had kind of typed a question. So Purbita, if you want, you can unmute yourself and maybe sort of just speak out. Yeah. So Rajarshi, can you see the question there?
Yes, I can see the question.
And we have a question from Pooja as well.
Okay, so let me look at Pooja's question first. She writes that, can we say that in Bengal, the upper classes, zamindars, taking to hunting, were not just doing it as a sport, but also appropriating ways of the colonial masters to reclaim some power negotiated by colonialist projects in their motherland? And also, can we say that it was also a way to re-establish that virility that was stripped away in certain narratives from the image of the Bengali Babu? Well, Pooja, you have in a way answered the question that you have asked. You were absolutely bang on target. Now, beyond that, I can tell you that I have, of course, freezed Bengali Babus and Bengali Shikar. In the monograph that I am writing, the last chapter of my monograph is about Bengali hunting narratives. And here I have found Bengali hunting narratives starting from, of course, early 20th century primarily. But there were Bengali hunters, zamindars and upper castes and landowners who were hunting in the early 19th century as well. One among them was part of the British pig sticking clubs. And the way he was hunting along with the British made the British pig sticking club members write a long article about him in one of the journals. And in the article, they not only praise the Bengali Babu for being a very masculine rider, they also praise him for being able to transform himself physically from a mere native to someone who is more or less like a British man. I would like to say that this concept of Anglicization becomes ingrained in hunting activities of the Bengali zamindars, especially after Macaulay's minute, 1835 minute. The entire concept that hunting was educative, physically educative, it was part of physical education, uh, is available as a discourse in most of the memoirs written by the Bengali hunters in the early 20th century and the middle 20th century as well. Uh, as to whether they were trying to bring back or reclaim some of the power negotiated by colonialist projects, yes, you can definitely say that. But I must also tell you that early 19th century was a time, if I am looking at early 19th century, was a time when the entire zamindari system had gone for a toss. And you can look at Sugato Bosu's writings or Suranjan Das's writings or any of the historians who write about peasant movements and zamindari during this period. The entire zamindari had gone for a toss. Bengal was recovering from famine, and Lord Cornwallis had established permanent settlement, which took away zamindaris from many. This is exactly the time when Tagores and Mondols decide to buy zamindari. They were not part of Indian class structure, Hindu upper class structure, but they buy zamindari from the East India Company because they're working with the East India Company. It was going through a strange transformation. I have not come across memoirs that refer to Bengali zamindars hunting in the early 19th century, but in the later years, they do hunt, and there are quite a few memoirs. Yes.
So we have another question from Purbita here.
Yeah, okay. So, Purbita, I'll just read it out. You talked about the managerial motive associated with hunting. Does this element of control and regulation of animals also entail management and disciplinary action committed upon the temporal space? Sorry, that is the environment. Or is it possible to think of animals as alienated from the environment? Um, um, I'm trying to understand what the question. I think you are trying to say that can we think of animals, can we separate the concept of environment from the animals at this stage? In the early 19th century, is that the temporal frame that you are referring to? Early 19th century? I'm not sure. Or are you referring to hunting as a, okay. So in the early 19th century, okay. So in the early 19th century, the managerial motive is not very prominent. It is there, definitely there. It is definitely there, but it is not extremely prominent. The sports that most of these writers talk about is a form of escapism, is a form of interacting with India, and as a form of looking at the beasts, etc. So here, as to, well, it's a good question actually, whether upon the temporal space. Okay. Again, I would like to think of it not exactly as a kind of a very strong disciplinary exercise. Most of these exercises, especially hunting, the way it is presented in the early 19th century, it was presented, I'm not saying it was presented as a very spontaneous activity. Okay, very kind of a very spontaneous activity. So and there was no intention of managing the forests or managing the beasts or disciplining the beasts at this point in the hunting narratives. These were about spontaneous interactions with India, killing animals, yes, trying to be a savior figure because the tigers are attacking Indians. The local cattle are being taken away by carnivores, so they go about hunting those animals. However, the disciplinary concept is not I did not find it very prominent. Maybe I will have to look at it in a different way. Thank you for your question. Maybe I'll think about it a bit more. I don't know if I've been able to respond to it properly, but maybe at a later stage I can respond to it. I'll think about it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Do we
sir.
have any?
Yeah,
Um,
thank you. Yeah.
yeah, uh, can I just go forward with another question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was not able to respond to ma'am because I was not able to unmute myself. Sorry for that. Yes, sir. I mean, you answered it just the way I was expecting. And my second question is, we have the concept of the Royal Bengal tiger.
Yeah.
Yeah, and whenever we come across this figure, we have an associated the associated environment is always kept in dark, something which is always romanticized.
Yeah.
Uh, so, how do you reflect on this mutual relationship between these two elements?
um, uh, Royal Tiger of Bengal and romanticization of the environment that they are in.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you have a temporal frame in mind? At what point um, are you talking about
Uh,
the present or maybe the 19th century
yeah, especially
or in general?
yeah, in general, I think it will be better. Yeah. Thank you.
In general, okay. Um, if you are talking about today we have just inherited some of these motifs. When we talk about Royal Tiger of Bengal, we try to romanticize it, and you are absolutely right. We have merely inherited most of these motifs. That's how I would respond to it if you are talking about today. But this attribute of Royal Tiger of Bengal appears to have been formalized in the late 19th century, especially with the writing of this very popular book with the hunters at least. And the title of this book is The Royal Tiger of Bengal by Joseph Ferrer. The book is available online. You can also look at it. This book considers tigers to be royal because of quite a few reasons. One, according to Joseph Ferrer, who develops a Darwinian concept of Indian forests, according to Joseph Ferrer, tiger is the king of this forest. Okay. Now, if tiger is the king of this forest, he is the predatorial king of the forest, and he is at the top of the food chain. He is using these Darwinian concepts to understand uh, Indian forests. Now, of course, he's not, when he says he's the king of the forest, royal beast of the forest, he's not referring to British royalty. Because at this point, if he says that, well, British royalty is rapacious, is predatorial, then you can imagine what can happen to him. He's working for Queen Victoria herself in Queen service. He's by Royal Tiger of Bengal, the term royal, he is referring to royalty. By royalty, he means Indian royalty. And you might, if you look at there are quite a few history books, including Thomas Metcalfe's Ideologies of the Raj, and there are quite a few other books where Indian royalty, especially after Doctrine of Lapse and other strange colonial imperial policies, they were portrayed as rapacious monsters, they were portrayed as dangerous, and they were portrayed as completely degenerate and barbaric and not suitable to rule Indians at all. So what Mr. Ferrer does is he attributes some of these characteristics to the Royal Tiger of Bengal. His term royal comes from that. Even though that they are royal, they have a regalia. Their looks are extremely fascinating. So that is how Joseph Ferrer theorized Royal Tiger of Bengal. But later, and I have argued this in one of the papers that I wrote, the paper is also available online, that the moment the conservation ethics kicks in, especially in the late 19th century, writers like E.B. Stebbing, who was a very important forest official, decide that the concept of tiger has to undergo a change. And Mr. Stebbing, Mr. Champion, and Corbett, you must have heard of Jim Corbett, they get on a mission periodically. Stebbing begins in early 20th century, followed by Mr. Champion, followed by Mr. Corbett. They get on a mission to transform this image of tiger from a rapacious monster to a beast who is just going about its business in the forest. Okay? So the concept of royal tiger of Bengal has a very strange genealogy of its own. Later on, in the post-colonial world, we have inherited, especially with Project Tiger, we have inherited some of these ideas and we have added nationalistic elements to it, especially with the concept of tiger as a national beast. So a national beast in a national environment is bound to be romanticized. I hope I have been able to give you a good response.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So do we have other questions from the audience? Then before I hand over to Antara, I have one last question, which is like a postscript. So this is more, a more general question, not only about, 19th century hunting. This is a more general question about the hunting ethics and how hunting is envisaged now. So, I mean, till the last decades of the 20th century, I would say hunting narratives were kind of, I'm talking about local tradition now. So we did have, certain hunting narratives, particularly as a, part of the children's literature or literature for the young adult. We did have hunting narratives then. So the first, it's a curiosity. Do we still have, such hunting narratives, Shikar stories? Because I don't see them very frequently, so I don't know about them. And if there are, I mean, how do they negotiate? Because if we look at the hunting narratives, which came up in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s with the, concept of conservation and with the concept of poaching, then we already see certain anxieties creeping in. So the modern hunters, like let's say Rijuda or some of these modern hunters, they were again they replaced the British savior figure to an extent. I mean, they were extremely apologetic about hunting tiger because tiger is a royal animal, so there is an ethical guilt. But at the same time, the way of dealing with it is invariably they would show that tigers are man-eaters. So as a part of the conservation project, they have to kind of kill these tigers, as opposed to the zamindars who would do it for sports, who were ruthless, or who were responsible for decimating the population of the tigers. But the anxiety was very apparent. So the present day hunting stories, how do they sort of negotiate with these dilemmas? And also, very briefly, if you could just tell us some of the critical frameworks to which apart from post-colonialism, what are the critical frameworks through which we can look at hunting stories from the present vantage point? So basically a very general question, but I think just to kind of close the discussion, round up the discussion.
Yeah, okay. I have, since I know Bengali, I have looked at a range of Bengali hunting memoirs, of course, from the early 20th century till about today. I don't think there are many hunting memoirs now. One of the last of the lot definitely was Rijuda, Buddhadev Guho. Satyajit Ray did write about hunting, especially in books like Royal Bengal Rahasya and others. But apart from that, there aren't many who are writing at a point, especially in the 50s, 40s. There were many Bengali writers who were writing about hunting, but especially their experience of hunting. But today there aren't many, because you can definitely understand 1972 and 1973, two very important years when Wildlife Protection Act came to be implemented in India. And after that, the entire discourse of wildlife has turned towards conservation and preservation. So today, if someone talks about hunting, I can think of Kullan Bosch, who writes about tigers, and there are others who write about tigers.
Hati Shikar, Jitikanto, so he also talks about
yeah,
not tigers and Hati. Yeah.
But he's a very old man, and he writes about hunting elephants long back, not today.
Right.
Hatir Boi, in Hatir Boi. Yeah, because well, yes. So with the when the zamindari system got over and the 1973, sorry, yeah, Wildlife Protection Act, the entire discourse has turned towards conservation. The other way, if we have to really look at these from a particular framework, I always go back to Satyajit Ray's Royal Bengal Rahasya. And this book is a book that is fascinating from the perspective I am in. I look at it as Feluda. I don't know if others know about this book. This is a book where a young sleuth, Bengali sleuth, very popular Bengali sleuth, decides to visit an old zamindari estate in North Bengal, Duars. And in Duars, he ends up staying with a zamindari family. And this family has a house filled with animal trophies. At some point, they were hunting a lot of animals. The young man, the owner of the house is a zamindar or an ex-zamindar who still has a lot of royalty left in him, pens wonderful Shikar stories. The entire story, yes, the film was also directed by Shandip Ray, and this entire story, when you think of it from today's perspective, is extremely anachronistic. You can't hunt anymore. It's very difficult to hunt. That too endures because 3 months ago, the Tiger Project report that came out showed that there are no tigers in Duars anymore. The Boxer Reserve, the entire Duars region has been decimated of tiger population. Tiger population is in very difficult condition in India right now. If you're following the Project Tiger reports, a terrible condition, terrible. So I have spoken to the forest officers and they tell me that the Duars region has been depleted of tigers for a long time now. They've not heard of tigers for a long time. So the entire anxiety of not having seen a tiger, inheriting the stories of Shikar, have to be paradoxically brought together. There is a lovely theorization from the animal, the post-human concept, from the post-human perspective, where one of the writers says that the animals go extinct in the environment and in the real world, animals start proliferating, or the memories of the animals start proliferating in the texts. So that could be a way to look at a book like Satyajit Ray's Royal Bengal Rahasya, The Mystery of Royal Bengal Tiger. Yeah, Anuparna.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very rich discussion, I think. But we have you have spoken for a very long time, so it's only fair that now we can sort of wind up the session. So I would kind of formally request Antara to just to say a formal thank you on behalf of the department, and then we can close the session. Antara, over to you, Antara.
Yeah, thank you, Anuparna. So I'd just like to thank Rajarshi for a very interesting talk and Q&A session. The Q&A session was also very rich and fascinating. So thank you, Rajarshi, and you've got us curious, me also very curious about some of these texts, and which I would like to go back to and try to uncover. So I'd like to also thank the audience and Anuparna for organizing this. And I think we will end on this note. It has been a long time. Thanks for your time and patience, Rajarshi. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was very good talking to you and the students around. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.